Hi, this is Gurasi Singh, and you're listening to my Thick Accent podcast. In this episode, we are privileged to have a regulated Canadian immigration consultant join us to share his invaluable insights on Canadian immigration. With his vast experience living in various parts of Canada, including Vancouver, Manitoba, Ottawa, Quebec, and now Toronto, he understands the diverse options that the country offers to newcomers. What sets him apart is his genuine commitment to helping individuals fulfill their dreams of pursuing education, building careers, and making Canada their home. His compassionate and authentic approach is grounded in his deep intercultural experience, having lived outside of Canada as well. Since obtaining his license in 2016, he has supported hundreds of people from around the world, providing personalized guidance and navigating the complexities of visas, study permits, work permits, permanent residencies, and citizenship. You know how hectic it can get. His background in education and international student advising further enhances his understanding of the unique challenges and aspirations of newcomers. Get ready to embark on a captivating conversation as we welcome Matthew McDonald.
Hello, good morning. Thanks so much for having me.
Very glad to have you on the podcast, Matthew. So let's just take you back to Manitoba, more specifically on a rural farm in Manitoba, where you grew up. Tell us a little bit about your formative years there and how that experience has shaped your perspective on location, countries, and careers.
Absolutely. So I'm from a region of Canada that's probably not as well known around the world. Manitoba is the name of the province. It's in the geographic center of Canada. It is a landmass the size of France, but it only has about 1 million people who live there. So I grew up on a farm. The nearest village was 6 miles from where I grew up. And so I was surrounded by large fields in the winter, which was just snow. But in the summer and the fall was these vast wheat fields and canola and flax. It's a beautiful natural setting. And with the agriculture there, you see just like seas of yellow and purple and blue and green in the summer. It's quite a stunning natural environment, but it is a challenging one because it's known as one of the colder places in Canada. So the summers are beautiful, but they're short. The winters are long, and there's a wonderful sense of community on the prairies. I think there's something about surviving against in the face of very dangerous natural forces, because it can get down to about minus 40 degrees in the winter.
Oh, wow.
So I grew up there, and it was a fairly isolated place. My village had 400 people. The nearest city was 100 kilometers away, and that was 50,000 people. So I did my undergraduate degree in that city. I use that in quotation marks because for us in Manitoba, city is 50,000. That's pretty big, but that's because I really grew up in a really more remote place. And it's a place that has been settled in Canada since the late 19th century. The early waves of immigrants there were Ukrainians, Scottish folks, the indigenous peoples of the area. There are Sioux and Cree peoples also in the area who are the original occupants of the land. And right now, there's new waves of newcomers coming to Manitoba. A lot of people from Latin America, the Philippines predominantly, but really around the world. And so it's really interesting from an immigration perspective to see the shifts that are happening in Manitoba from this place that I grew up, where I felt there really wasn't a huge amount of diversity. And then so part of the reason I left Manitoba was a desire to see the world. I had such a curiosity about the world. I felt very isolated on my small farm, and I had no interest in farming as a career. I didn't know what I wanted my career to be, but I knew that I wanted to leave farming. I thought it's a big world. It's a big, interesting world. I want to learn more about it. So I started learning more about it through education. Actually, it was university that helped me transition out of the agricultural environment. I moved 100 kilometers away. I went to a very small university in Manitoba called Brandon University. It's about 3,000 students. So that was part of my transition out to learn more about the world. And by studying literature, by studying French, by doing several summer exchanges in Quebec, I started incrementally to learn more about different cultures and different peoples. First of all, by getting comfortable in a new language, I think was part of my how I opened myself to the world. And then I ultimately moved away from Manitoba in order to do further studies in Ottawa. So I really tell my story about an incremental move away from a very small location as I gained more confidence in order to test out new locations and new places that were less familiar to me. Up until now, I'm currently in Toronto, which is Canada's largest city, as everyone knows, and it's the place where most immigrants tend to start their journeys. It's one of the main landing points in Canada, because I think there's a lot of comfort for anyone who moves from across the world. You can find people from your home community in Toronto. It really is such a diverse and cosmopolitan place, and I think that's one of the great and exciting things. And I think that's what attracts me to Toronto in many ways. I love the statistic that over half of the people who live in Toronto were not born in Canada.
Yeah.
But I also think about how Toronto is a really great place it's a city where people can figure themselves out. People start anew. People have a fresh start. And I think that some of the themes of your podcast, some of your other guests have talked about making career choices, making switches in your careers, figuring out who you want to be when maybe the place you grew up in is not where you felt you wanted to stay. And I think that's one of the reasons I have a lot of identification. I find a lot of joy working in the immigration space, or Canadian immigration, global mobility, whatever you call it. I think my understanding is is rooted in the same desire to just make change for your life, to take control of your life. When the place you grew up in feels like it's not quite right for one reason or another. I think my part of mine was perhaps being with my sexuality at the time, there wasn't a lot of support for being gay. That's changed a lot. Manitoba is such a more open place than it was when I grew up in the 1980s and 1990s, much like the rest of the world. And so I do want to highlight Manitoba a bit on this podcast too. Not just Toronto, because I think a lot of what is happening in Canadian immigration right now is a shift away from the major cities, a shift away from Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto, to start looking at these other regions of Canada that are less populated, but also just less well known on the global stage. So I don't think many people, halfway around the world know about Manitoba, and so they don't think about moving there, and they don't know what awaits them there. They don't know anybody who lives there. But there's a shift happening as I think some of our cities are getting more populated quickly, and housing is having a trouble keeping up, and our cities are getting expensive. And so places like Manitoba start to seem a lot more attractive in Canada because they're much lower cost of living.
It clearly explains the reason you do the work that you do is because of your story, because the journey that you have had and the experiences that you have gained throughout the time. That definitely, I think, reflects in the work you do. But I also have so many questions about, just the things that you have just said. And the first thing is, tell us something that people don't know about Manitoba that you would like to share.
Absolutely. I'm going to start with Ukrainians, I think, is maybe one thing that is maybe not well known. Different parts of Manitoba have different people groups that have settled. It's part of Canada's colonial project has been to try to entice people to move to Manitoba.
Okay.
So a lot of the people who moved to Manitoba, especially originally, in the last 2 centuries, have come from more northern places. So places like Ukraine, there's people from Iceland. There's a region in the Great Lakes region that's a lot of Scandinavian and Icelandic folks.
Interesting.
Where I grew up, there's a lot of Ukrainians. And I think that is, when you look at me, see my name, Matthew McDonald, which has, we think we're Scottish. We're fairly certain, but peasants didn't keep very good family records when they moved across the ocean to start farming. And so I think part of my interest in other cultures came from another people group that was predominant in my region. Not my family was very like Englishy, Scottishy, but I was wannabe Ukrainian in some ways when I was a kid, because they had such great food, and I was so fascinated by this culture that I didn't know about. They have different words for their grandparents, like Baba. I was like, oh, what, Baba and Gigi,
Yeah.
and so I'm by meeting friends. I guess that was maybe my early or cultural exposure, and I really got excited about that. And so I'd say that's one thing that people may not know about Manitoba. There's a story of Métis people in Manitoba. There's the story of different English and Scottish settlers. But I think one of the interesting things about Manitoba is the number of Ukrainians who are a big part of the province's history, and that's part of why I think right now with the war in Ukraine, why a number of Ukrainians are resettling in Manitoba right now, because of that shared historical connection.
Okay. And you also talked about how half the people in Toronto are the international people. And let me share with you like this inside joke that we have in India. And so I come from the northern part of India, and there's a state called, or a province called Punjab. So I'm Punjabi. So there's a joke in the Punjabi community that since there are so many Punjabis in Toronto, there's a joke that, whenever somebody moves here, somebody new to the city or the country moves here, and they say, oh, there are like 20,000 Punjabis and just few foreigners are here. So we always joke about that because there's like a major Indian community that kind of resides in Toronto right now.
Absolutely. And I know some of the Indians in my life have, especially when I met someone, I had lunch with someone who's of South Indian descent.
Yeah.
And when we were chatting, he was like, there's people, all of India isn't just like Punjabi people, because I know that's what you see mostly in Toronto. So I absolutely hear your point.
Yeah.
Other people who are not Punjabi wanted to clarify, because you're right, it's a very predominant people group who've settled here.
And you also talked about Ukrainian cuisine. So have you ever tried Indian cuisine?
Yes, and and my husband actually really likes to try to cook it as well. I don't claim skill, but I absolutely adore Indian cuisine. I'm mostly familiar with, I think, Northern Indian cuisine, which is easier to find in Toronto.
You're right, yeah.
I've learned more about Southern Indian cuisine as well. I can't say that I am great at distinguishing beyond regions at this point, though.
No, it's funny you said that northern and the southern Indian food, because majority of the people I meet, they say Indian food, and the food that you get in Canada, mostly it's the northern Indian food, like the butter chickens and our curries and everything. And South Indian has its own amazing type of dishes, which I think most of them I also have never tried in my life because I never visited the south of India much. But yes, you are right. They are different cuisines, totally different, and different flavors, different spices also to some extent. You're right. Yeah.
Well, I can recommend a restaurant. I'll find the name afterwards for you in Little India. It's on Gerrard Street East in Toronto. If you come to Toronto, that's been my exposure.
So, Matthew, we will definitely talk in detail about you pursuing the Canadian immigration as a career, but talk a little bit about the other careers that you had before this.
My career choice of Canadian immigration is really one that fell upon me. I did not choose to. I did not wake up and decide I want to be a regulated Canadian immigration consultant at age 10, nor did I say I wanted to be a lawyer. I did spend a few years teaching, actually. I moved into the education system after finishing my master's degree, again, mostly because I had the opportunity. I think I never had a charted out life. I had a sense of curiosity. I wanted to try new things. I think I have a bit of an adventure and a hope that it will work out, which is, I think, I share with a lot of people who move to Canada. I think it takes a lot of courage to move countries. I think it takes a lot of bravery to pick up your life, start anew in another place with the expectation that you will make it work, that you can do it, that you can overcome challenges. I think that's one of the things I love about working with so many of my clients from around the world, that courage, because I remember that of moving away from my home farm, moving to study university. My parents didn't really understand why I was studying English literature and how that would help my career. And to be honest, I didn't either. I just trusted the process. I trusted I would get there, and I pursued my master's degree in English literature as well. Again, I had no career plan. I
Hmm.
just loved studying it, and I was fortunate enough to get some scholarships so that didn't have to go into debt to do a master's degree. And that was a good enough reason for me to try it out.
Hmm.
I thought, if I can afford to live for 2 more years of studying, I'm just going to do it because I'm having a great time. And then I had the opportunity to be a teaching assistant during my master's degree, which led to me being invited back to my undergraduate university to teach summer courses there, some first year university courses.
Hmm.
This, because of my interest in French, took me overseas, which was my next step.
Okay, so let's just pivot towards the time when you moved abroad for the first time. You lived in France for some time, lived in Macedonia. So it was also, I believe, the first time when you moved outside of Canada. And you were telling me that not enough people move out of Canada. They try to stay within the country. So it was your first time. Tell us about your first day when you landed in those countries and what was going on in your mind.
I have a very distinct memory of when I arrived in Paris. I flew to Paris. I got out of the airport. I don't really remember dealing with anything
Hmm.
at the airport, but I do remember taking a train into the city,
Hmm.
stepping out and seeing those very stereotypical, like 6-story buildings with the little Juliet balconies that is like this classic Paris image. And even though this was probably not one of the most beautiful areas of Paris, it was by a train station.
Okay.
I do remember stepping out and thinking, myself growing up on that small farm in rural Manitoba, I never thought I'd have the chance to see Paris.
Mm.
And what a dream it was. Little old me be halfway across the world and seeing something that I had only ever seen in movies.
Hmm.
And I remember being humbled by that moment and very appreciative of that moment of being able to just live in a place that I had once only dreamed of.
Very, very interesting. Okay. And were there any challenges that you faced while living there? And I remember you also saying that it felt like you got another lens on. Talk a little bit about that.
Oh, absolutely. I think in we often talk about culture shock as a bit of a wave,
Yeah.
where when a person arrives in a new place, and I think this happens when people move to Canada as well. There's an early spurt where everything is great and exciting and new, and you're
Yeah.
exposed to different things, and you're excited about this place. The first several weeks, it's everything is just has a wow factor. You're still in almost a bit of a tourist mode, and so things are fun and exciting, and that is the phase before the real challenges sink in. And if we
Hmm.
talk about a wave after the culture shock, often then it
Hmm.
gets to a much lower period for a point that that drops down when the
Hmm.
reality sets in. The challenges are there. So I definitely
Absolutely.
remember going through my first probably 3-4 weeks of just loving this new place, total vacation mode, discovering new things before it started to sink in that my language abilities were really limiting my social life in
Hmm.
France. And even though I was functional in French, I was not fluent. So which
Yeah.
prevented me from building relationships with locals. I
Hmm.
remember feeling lonely and I'm spending a lot more time by myself than I had anticipated, and that's not something that I was used to. And I didn't have anybody nearby to just call up to go for coffee, and I think that was one of the challenges I remember facing.
Hmm.
And then I think as I did build relationships over the next few months, I think I remember this feeling I had that it was hard to face in thinking, oh, if I were to stay here, I would never be French. And I think I thought a lot about what that means. That how I could not be absorbed into the kind of the French identity, and what that
Hmm.
means. And I think that's probably not what a lot of people feel. Or maybe some people say, "Well, Matthew, you're stupid. Why would you ever think that you could be French?" Because you're an Anglophone who grew up in the middle of Canada. But I think that because of how I grew up in Canada, and I think Canada is a distinctive place in the world in that I have that mindset that a person can move to another country and assume the identity of the location they're going to, because that's very much how I view Canadian identity.
Yeah.
Is that anybody can be Canadian, because a Canadian identity is something that we are co-creating together. It's not shared. It's not about a shared ethnic background.
Hmm.
It's not even a shared linguistic background anymore. I thought about that and what that meant in France, and how how what didn't feel like a place where I aspired to live long term. And coming to terms with those feelings within me and how those feelings are in relation to probably my sense of what national identity is and what it should be growing up. It was probably one of my challenges in France. And if I may hop over to Macedonia, I remember a comparable feeling when I was there, of wishing of when I learned more about the former Yugoslavia, and I was just kind of wowed by this period of Yugoslavia that I didn't know until I lived in the region, and saying at one point that I so admired these people, these ex-Yugoslav people, and what kind of late Yugoslav life was like, that I actually told my husband after we visited a museum of the history of Yugoslavia. I said, I wish I were ex-Yugoslav too. I'm just this sense of desire to connect with a history and people. I should probably unpack that. There's a lot more going on there than I at the surface level it seems. But I think about that as I moved abroad, and I keep that in mind about when people move to Canada too, and when you're navigating an identity in a new place.
Absolutely,
I think you're trying to figure out yourself in relation to this new place. Some in places like France, for example, where there's very strong ethnic national identities, it can be hard to feel like you integrate into that. And I know Canada certainly is not perfect, but I think there's more of an openness to the identity being, as I said, co-created. It's shifting; it's not fixed, and that the newcomers are welcome to add to that identity creation. And so I remember my own past times with being in other places, other people's, trying to learn about their histories and trying to figure out my place in that was, I think, something that I keep in mind as I work with, and as I'm now back in Canada, and I work with people who have recently arrived here or are aspiring to move to Canada.
Now, you touched on some amazing factors, starting from where everything is nice and hunky-dory initially, and then the reality kicks in and you feel that loneliness and even to some extent homesickness also. And I think definitely the feeling of not feeling that belonged in this new nation, I think we all kind of feel that coming from different parts of the world. And I think definitely Canada is more welcoming than other nations. But tell me, Matthew, you said that there was a moment where you did feel loneliness and you spent more time with yourself that you thought of doing that. Tell us what did that time taught you, or something that stayed with you and you kind of, because you kind of fall into this introspection and you have to talk to yourself and have to kind of face the thoughts that you never might even think about, or never even, because I feel like I'll give an example. When I was in India, I did have a lot of distractions, right? I can go and sit with my parents, I can call my friends and everything. But I feel like that happened with me when I came to Canada. There were times when I was alone, especially during pandemic, and I had to talk to myself and listen to my thoughts. And that actually has taught me a lot of things about myself, and I have definitely a better version of myself. But I want to know from you, that what did you learn from that time?
So, I don't think I learned as much as I should, in all honesty. I'm glad to hear that you listened to your thoughts and you were alone with yourself. I think it took me a number of years just to get comfortable doing that. I think I still managed to avoid sitting with myself and thinking with myself at that time. I would read, I would dream. I think that's maybe I occupied myself by dreaming.
That's also necessary, yeah.
Yeah, of travel and dreaming of other places I wanted to visit. And so I learned that, I wasn't going to settle in France. It was a 9-month period anyway. It was not planned to be a long-term thing, but it really helped me. I used my spare time to research other places that I could learn more or travel to. I used every last penny I had to try to see more places during that time. I thought, I have a new home base in Europe. Where can I go? I was able to even go to North Africa as well during one of my vacations. And I really used it to try to, as I said, follow my curiosity as it to see more places, to learn about more new peoples and other cultures. Because I didn't know how easily I would be able to ever do that again after that period ended.
I think in my case, it was more about, like you said, dreaming. It was about starting this podcast because I kind of thought about it, conceptualized this, and the idea, the name and everything was during the time when had nothing else to do. So that was like, that this is the product of that loneliness, I would say.
So glad you were productive. This is a great outcome.
So moving on, Matthew. So when we go to our story tab on your website, we see four words as a banner image: warmth, understanding, authenticity, and integrity. And when I read that, without even going further, just reading that resonated with me because that's exactly an immigrant needs: the warmth and being understood in the new world where the authenticity is appreciated while keeping intact the integrity. But I want you to tell us your interpretation of it and obviously your story that led you to lend a helping hand to newcomers. Tell us all about that.
Absolutely. Well, I think, as I mentioned, I spent some time moving around. I moved out of my home province, Ottawa. I moved to France for a year, and then after I came back from France, I was ready to leave Canada again. I just had this. I was dreaming. I used my year to dream about other places I could go, and so
Mhm.
I had an opportunity to go to what is now called North Macedonia, but it's I know it as Macedonia. It's part of the former
Yeah.
Yugoslavia in southeastern Europe, and it's a country mixed with Orthodox Christians, Muslims. There's peoples from influences from Turkey, Greece. There's Albanian peoples, Serbs. There's a lot of kind of mixing of peoples from the region. I got to know kind of the more traditional Macedonian mainstream society, which is Slavic-speaking peoples. And as I was working at an international school there, so there's a lot of the children of business people and diplomats and so forth. So again,
Hmm.
giving me greater exposure to the world. And a lot of my work was about helping students go and find universities or colleges to study around the world after high school. But in my personal life, I met and fell in love with someone locally, and he his name is Igor, and he's from Skopje, Macedonia. He had also done it. He had also spent some time abroad, and I think that was my through him I was best able to really understand the society in which I was living, and I was able to through him understand some of the challenges that accompany living in the Macedonians face living there, because I as an expat would only had a surface level understanding of what was going on, I think, until I met him. And so
Hmm.
a lot of my warmth and understanding in my Canadian immigration work,
Yeah.
I think, comes from my day to day lived experience of marrying. First of all, of seeing. I remember he helped me understand Macedonia, but then eventually it became my job to help him try to understand Canada, because
Yeah.
as a same sex couple, his home country does not recognize same sex relationships, and we had to figure out if we wanted to be together, we had to get serious pretty quickly, and decide if we were
Hmm.
going to try to stay together long term, because we had different nationalities. I was on an employer specific work permit in Macedonia, and so that's ultimately the reason why we decided to come back to Canada together. Even though we had a wonderful life in Macedonia, and we were very sad to go, but we felt for stability we needed to come to Canada, and so
Hmm.
that brings me again the understanding of the challenge of relocation, which I'll speak about momentarily, but also the authenticity. I have worked so hard over my life from leaving
Hmm.
my small home village where I knew in my heart that it just wasn't the place that I was meant to stay. My heart
Hmm.
longed to be other places, and and part of that I said was coming out of the closet. And I really, when I say authenticity, part of that is just being myself, and
Yeah.
all in all of the different ways. Um, you know, my sexuality is only one part of my identity. It's using my big loud voice. It's being confident. It's being true to my heart.
Yeah.
And I recognize that in people who are relocating for one reason or another. People come to Canada for so many reasons, and part of my work is 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 understanding that and having a heart for why people are relocating, even if they're not the same reasons that I have been a bit of a nomad.
Yeah.
So I also I think the understanding, the warmth, the authenticity. I use those words because I remember living through the struggles of my husband's first few years in Canada. That really
Mm.
gave me the best possible lens on immigrant experience in Canada. Because I lived abroad for a bit over 4 years in different contexts in France and Macedonia, but in some ways I think I was never planning to stay there permanently. So I knew I was
Yeah.
always on a short term trip in those places, and I had I not met my husband, I really my understanding of those places would have remained fairly superficial. Um,
Mhm.
and so then we moved to Canada, and my husband had lived in Chicago. He did his undergraduate studies there, so he'd been in North America, and I kind of thought this would be an easy transition for him. He's been to a big North American city before. We know what we're
Yeah.
getting into, and it was really tough. And I say that he's for my thick accent podcast. It's worth noting he has a very he does not have much of he has a very North American accent. I think is the
Mhm.
best way to put it. He sounded
Yeah.
American, not Canadian, when he arrived. But he he did not have some of the challenges that people feel related to their accent when he speaks. His challenges, so he's a white man, but he has the name Igor. And
Mhm.
so people, when they see his resume, they're not quite sure what to make of it. They see his name on Facebook. So I was able to start to see what it's like coming to Canada when when you don't have an English or Scottish name that is familiar, that
Mm.
people assume, or that people are more familiar with as part of Canadian history, and what it looks like to get a new job and to change your career, actually, to rebuild a
Mm.
career from scratch in a city where we knew 3 people in Toronto when we moved here, and to
Mhm.
start to build a new life. And I saw that in the type of jobs that he would position himself to get. How very quickly he looked at kind of going down several levels in his career, because
Mm.
he just assumed he wouldn't be able to make a lateral move across countries in terms of seniority.
Yeah.
And I saw that in contrast with how I was able to get stable work more quickly. I got my job at Humber College as an international student advisor about
Mhm.
within 6 months of arriving in back in Canada, and it took him probably, I think, about 2 years before he was off short term contracts. He worked a lot of short term contracts. So and that weighed on him at home. And I remember trying to be supportive through that whole career journey, which can really it can really break a person's spirit when you feel you're skilled, you are um,
Absolutely. Yeah.
you have so much to contribute to the workplace, and it's really hard on the ego when you feel like you can't, when people are not recognizing that in this new place. And so I think having lived through those several very challenging years for him and trying to support him, as I was also trying to figure things out in a big new city on my own, at age 28, I think that's where also I say that I have a lot of understanding. And so I speak to so many international students too who are going through their own transitions. As a lot of my work, I've worked with many international students, and I think I'm really interested in those first 2 or 3 years of, we call this the settlement period. There's like theory about this, that the settlement period, there's settlement services in Canada for the first 1 to 4 years that are the
Yeah.
hardest
Yeah.
for people, before people move towards what's ultimately integration, which theorists say it takes up to about the 10-year mark, and that's when you really
Mhm.
feel like you're integrated in this new place. You're at home. You know the way things work.
You belong.
And so that's where my heart is. And I think then I add the integrity to one of the words. Again, it's I think they're I see them as interlinked, but it's having values and sticking to them, knowing what your
Yeah.
values are, stating them. Maybe my values will not align with other people's. People have different
Mhm.
values, but I think I I think it's important for me to state what my values are, and that I will continue to live by them, and speak them out loud. To say if I agree or disagree with something, to use the voice that I have to state what I think is the right thing to do, the right way to treat people, the right way to navigate the Canadian immigration system, and so forth.
No, I think thank you, Matthew, for articulating, these words in your work and the way you have explained it. I think it definitely would resonate with every immigrant that come to the country. And I think you said in the beginning that you didn't know what career you want to get into, but I feel like you were kind of destined to get into this career with the experiences that you have had going abroad, meeting your husband and then coming here. So yes, like you said, you do work with a lot of international students and immigrants. And so tell us, like, with your expertise in working with them, some of the common challenges that you come across when navigating the Canadian immigration system, and how do you help them to overcome those hurdles?
Sure. I think of there's maybe two big points. One I see is picking a program of study. I know
Hmm.
I don't. When I worked in the college system, I think there was a lot of short-term thinking that I really tried to coach people through. When people are thinking about their immigration status, they move to Canada, and maybe their place of living was not as close to where they were planning to study, and people are looking at making quick changes to what they're going to study, where they're going to live,
Yeah.
which college, which level, and I know with all those stressors, I think I'm trying to help people have longer term thinking when making big choices about education, is one of the big things that I
Mm.
tried to do. Is It's very easy to think of in a survival mode of I need to change my program for reasons X, Y, Z, so just to solve my immediate problems. And one
Mhm.
of the things I really tried to help with international students is to take a bit more pause in that decision making process, because whatever program you study and where you study and where you live, those are going to have impacts for years to come.
Yeah.
And I would see, for example, people who already had bachelor's degrees and years of work experience then switch to maybe lower level diplomas that weren't going to challenge them and really help them grow in their career in the same way. So I would
Mhm.
see, for example, even switching from a postgraduate level business graduate certificate to a diploma level, a diploma, which is at the undergraduate level. I would see just for to change, to save time on a commute. And I
Mhm.
recognize a commute in the immediate horizon is a challenge, but there can be longer term implications on the career. So I think that's one of the challenges that I saw a lot of international students face their immediate arrival in Canada. And then the other big
Mhm.
one I think is career. It's after people graduate, where there's the challenge of finding work. And I can get that. I grew up in Canada and I came out of the Canadian education system. And let
Yeah.
me tell you, I had no idea what I was going to do after I finished university. There were a lot less co-ops, a lot less career services when I went to university, and it's much better now in terms of the supports available. But I left the country because I didn't know what to do for a job in Canada.
Mhm.
And for people who are new to Canada, they've maybe had 1 or 2 years here, and then they need to find work. They need to find work quickly, especially because it's tied to their immigration status. It's a very stressful period.
Of course. Yeah.
And I think the other big challenge international students face is transition to employment. But I think my
Mm.
response to that is the advice I give to reduce the stress of finding a job after graduation. Think of it as a slow building process that begins early when you first start your studies. That's I think we talk a lot about networking
Yeah.
in their educational context, and it can feel a little um, false, or it can feel a little awkward or challenging to do at first for everybody, regardless of where you come from.
Yeah.
I think I've only really figured it out in the past maybe 3 years. I've been helped a lot because I work at the business school at the University of Toronto, and in the MBA world, networking is also it's a whole other thing. But
Hmm.
so I've learned through working there about how networking is not so much about it is about getting jobs, but it's not the direct link to get the job. It's to talk to people who do other jobs to help figure out if that's something of interest to you or not.
Yeah.
So you can be like, oh, I thought that doing this job was like this, but now I'm not as interested anymore. So I'm gonna talk to someone different who does a slightly different job, and maybe that company to see if that that's a kind of company I would like to work for beyond the surface level things that you can find out um, online through a company's website, for example. But that takes time, and so that's why I think the other challenge that international students face is building towards that career, because you can't wait until you graduate to find the job. But it's also hard to do this networking and try to start to slowly figure out how you want to build a career in this new place when you're sometimes doing survival work. And it's expensive being an international student.
Yeah.
You need to work to pay the bills, and that's a huge challenge of trying to balance financial challenges with time to work on the career things that you want to work on, do your studies, and also like get some sleep and have a social life.
Hmm. Well, managing all that coming from a different world is sometimes a little nerve-wracking, especially like you said about transitioning into the employment. I think in that time, all most of us are have just finished their studies and we are getting the work permit, and we make sure that we don't let those 3 years get wasted. And what if we don't get the employment? What if we don't get the job that can help us get the permanent residency? I think that's why it's such a tough phase and a challenging phase for international students. Like you said, they need to start doing it before they even get graduated. Talk to them, see if you want to get into this field or not. Is that something you really want to get into? Is that something you really feel like you can stay in, until you get a residency even? So yeah, thank you for sharing these. And is there any success story, any memorable success story of a client, Matthew, that you have worked with, and the impact it had in their life?
I'm gonna share a story of someone whose path was not linear.
Hmm.
I had a client who I knew from Humber College, and she was studying a program related to hospitality.
Hmm.
And so, she had done that in India. And so it was a natural move to come and do studies related to hospitality at a postgraduate level. And she studied, she graduated, she worked in the industry, and actually stayed, became a permanent resident through the Ontario Immigrant Nominee Program because
Hmm.
her employer sponsored her. She was working for a restaurant actually as a food service supervisor that
Hmm.
was willing to give her a permanent job offer. So she became a permanent resident. She got married. Her husband joined her actually, and he studied as well in Toronto at a different college. And so but I supported them through a few different phases of study permit life, post graduation work permit, and transition to permanent residence.
Hmm.
But I think what I think is most exciting about their story is actually when they after they had settled and they'd done kind of the essential things. Then during the pandemic, like many
Hmm.
people, they had a bit of time to reflect. Restaurants closed, so they working in hospitality
Yeah.
was not a viable option, and they used that opportunity to reflect about what they want to do and make another big change. So
Hmm.
first they moved from India to Canada, and they
Hmm.
start in Toronto, and then they're like, maybe I'll change my career and I'll also move out to the Okanagan region in British Columbia
Okay.
and become an accountant. And now she's studying to be a CPA. What inspires me in working in Canadian immigration is people like this who take control of their life. They're courageous,
Hmm.
they're brave. They say, I want to do a new thing. I'm going to go to that place and figure it out. I don't have all the
Yep.
answers right now, but I will take it step by step, and I will get there. I believe in myself. I believe in myself, and I will do it. And so I think that's one story, and I think I really appreciate the journey from the kind of survival to getting permanent residence to making a career change, which I think it
Mhm.
takes a whole bunch of new courage yet again.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And are there any upcoming changes or updates in the Canadian immigration system or policies that may be relevant to the international students, if you're aware of?
So I think a lot of international students are really good at educating themselves on Canadian immigration and changes that are coming. I definitely see that in all the international students that I talk to. The big things that we're looking ahead to in 2023 are that express entry is going to introduce occupation-specific draws.
Mhm.
So the expectation is healthcare and tech are probably some of the areas where there or will be hired where there will be targeted draws. And that this is connected to a broader conversation about trying to encourage immigration outside of Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. I
Mm.
think there's at the higher levels of the Canadian government. I actually had the chance to speak to Sean Fraser, who's our current
Oh, wow.
Minister of Immigration. I was
Mhm.
at an event and I had 5 minutes that I got to have a beer with him. And
Mm.
at the event and in our conversation, some of that was about um, changes to the immigration system to help encourage people to move to places like Manitoba, where
Mm.
there's a lot of more space, housing is less of a challenge, and there's still lots of economic opportunity. So I think we're going to see some changes. We're going to see a regionalization again of Canadian immigration. So I think that's one thing that I'm watching for. And the other
Mhm.
thing that I think is relevant to international students is the strategies are going to change. I think express entry, the points are very, very high. It's become very, very competitive.
Yeah.
And that's in part because right now there's about 2 million temporary residents in Canada, students and
Mhm.
workers.
Mhm.
And a lot of them want to become permanent residents. The vast majority of them, I assume.
Yeah.
But Canada's accepting up to 500,000 people by 2025 per year. So there's a lot of temporary residents, but not enough permanent residence spots. So I think
Mhm.
we're facing several years of challenges for international students transitioning to permanent residence. But I'm happy that IRCC is aware of that, and that's why we're seeing things like the post graduation work permit extensions
Mhm.
to give international students more
Yeah.
time to transition, to recognize that international students have come here with a plan to relocate their life and their careers to a new country, and that our immigration system needs to give them more flexibility to do that. And I think that there is. I'm happy to see that policies are being developed to create that flexibility, because I know a lot of international students are going through a lot of stress. I've been invited to a few WhatsApp groups, and there's a lot of fear about not being able to transition to permanent residence after making such a big bet on yourself.
No, I think definitely the one with the extension of the work permit is such a relief, because I remember when mine got extended and I received it at my home. I think I received mine in like 11 days. That was back in 2021. And when I received that, I remember I got a little emotional when I saw it, because I was like, okay, I just had like 4 months left to for my work permit, Matthew. And if I was like, okay, do I have to go back? What will happen? I'll be thrown out of the country. So that was such a relief, and I'm glad that the government is doing it. That's really a big, big relief to us. But tell us more about other services that are available to my listeners, under the Matthew McDonald Immigration Services, and where they can connect with you.
Sure. So my main work actually is with international students. That's been the probably the niche in my career. Right now, I work with a lot of people who are
Mhm.
thinking about studying in Canada, and I really like helping people outside of Canada before they apply, because I think part of
Mhm.
what is unique about my skill set is that I can see the bigger picture. And so when people are applying to study in Canada, I can also talk to them about the program of study they're choosing, the city where they want to go, the
Yeah.
type of career they're aspiring to, because I have enough maturity with working with international students and in so many different areas and different sectors within Canada that I can at least give some context to what their trajectory might go if they choose a particular program of study. I do a lot of work in supporting transitions to permanent residence. A lot of my clients are former international
Mhm.
students, and then I get a few more interesting cases from time to time. Usually, a lot of people come to me when when things are not going smoothly and they need strategy.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of what I do is actually just talk to people like this about their challenges and work through what are the different options, what are the different strategies, and really help so that people can do informed decision making about what their options and just have some reassurance about the options that they do or do not have. And I like to try to help give people strategy and peace of mind. I think I say a lot. Sometimes people want to book time with me, which they can do directly through my website, yourcanadianstory.ca. And I use the word peace of mind, and we have a chat. And I say, I hope that you are able to sleep better tonight. That you are not going to let this worry. You let yourself worry. That although it's not all sorted out yet, to have the peace of mind knowing that it is going to be. And I think a lot of what I try to do is try to help people find reassurance, try to find those anchors of that they can know that things will work out that on their journey, despite the feeling that it's often so precarious.
Well, sounds amazing. And to all my listeners, all the links to contact Matthew can be found in the show notes. So Matthew, there's one thing I came across on your website and something which is a little new for me was the intra-company transfers, which is not the LMIA. Tell us a little bit about that if you can educate on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the ways that people do come to Canada, often this is maybe not where they're planning to immigrate, but maybe they just get an opportunity. So for multinational companies, some of the biggest companies you can name, they have if they need to relocate staff members to another office in another country, there are labor market impact exemption codes. Let's say Apple, for example. Apple has an office in Canada, and it needs to move someone from one of its other offices around the world. Part of Canadian immigration law allows them to just move that person from the office outside of Canada to the office in Canada to get a work permit. They don't need to prove that they don't need to get an LMIA. And so it's actually a bit of a smoother transition for the person coming to Canada because they have a job lined up when they get here. They have a bit of a sense of community through this company they already work for. Let me give you an example, maybe to illustrate this a bit better. One of my former clients is originally from Argentina, and he was actually he had first moved with his company from Argentina to Costa Rica, and I met him when he was living in Costa Rica. He was moved to Costa Rica because of needs of the company within Latin America. Was working in human resources, and then he wanted to move to Canada. So he actually approached his company that had offices in Canada, and he asked if it would be possible to be relocated to Canada because he wanted to have some experience living in Canada. He had visited once, and he wanted to spend more time here. So that's a case where his company was actually very facilitative, and they agreed to relocate his job from Costa Rica to Canada. And then ultimately, he was able to use his Canadian work experience to help him on his transition to permanent residence, to immigrate through the Canadian Experience class. He will be submitting his citizenship application in another month or two. And so that's an example of an intra-company transfer, because this is a company that has offices around the world. And so it doesn't work out for everyone. You have to be working for a large multinational company that has offices in Canada. But that's how the intra-company transfer works. But of course, you're locked to that employer.
And are there any particular requirements, like you have to work at least this number of years and then only you can have the transfer?
So there are some requirements around having to have the skill sets for the job, for example, that you are, or the minimum education requirements for the job that you're being transferred for. If I can simplify it, the greatest challenge in this process is not actually with Canadian immigration. The biggest challenge is usually with the company you work for. That's where there's usually a lot of restrictions. So I talk to people, some who work in finance and accounting for some of the big firms like KPMG and such. And
Yeah.
They have these are examples of multinationals, and usually the company locally will say you have to work for us for a minimum of 2 or 3 years before you are eligible.
Mm-hmm.
Because I
Yeah.
as part of some of my work at the University of Toronto, I talk to people who want to relocate to Canada, and I'll more often talk to people who work in large multinationals in finance and accounting, and often
Mm-hmm.
the company itself requires a minimum work experience before they will let them go.
Yeah.
I speak to probably a lot of people in China, Hong Kong, and India more often. And that's one of the pathways
Yeah.
that people try to use, and sometimes and do so successfully at times to relocate.
And it is still a closed work permit, if I'm not wrong.
Yes, but then you're locked to
Yeah.
that employer. You cannot change jobs.
Yeah.
So you have to be prepared that you're really committed to this company and you want to stay with that company.
Yeah.
Different from a labor market impact assessment or LMIA, where you more or less have to demonstrate that, or the company has to demonstrate that they can't find a qualified Canadian permanent resident or citizen to hire, which
Yeah.
I used to say was extremely difficult to do, but now is, with the way the labor market is now, is easier to get, in my understanding, than it has been in previous years.
But I think I have to say that not everybody follows the right path. Some people do charge a lot of money, like, not the right money, so to say. They exploit the people who are desperate to stay in Canada. And I think people should be a little more aware about those people. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't actually do work in LMIAs myself, but I know that there's, I get to the word integrity. There's a lot of corruption in that area. A
Yeah.
lot of exploitation that I hear about, which is really sad. People absolutely prey
Mm-hmm.
on desperation, and I think that. I think people know that they should not. I think a lot of people know that they should not need to pay for a job offer or LMIA, but I think it's desperation
Mm-hmm.
that the people end up doing it.
Absolutely.
And I've been speaking to a number of people, and IRCC is aware of it, and is
Mm-hmm.
looking at the policy levers to try to try to address it, but it's pervasive, and that's really a taint on Canada's immigration system that I hope we can find a way to fix.
Okay, so Matthew, how can we not talk about the Canadian citizenship? And like you said, there are 2 million temporary residents who are going to become the permanent residents in the coming years. But we have seen the recent pattern that people are choosing not to be the citizen. I would like to know your thoughts on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there's one very simple explanation that I think we can look at first. It's that
Mm-hmm.
people from some nationalities, if they get Canadian citizenship, they are supposed to give up their
Mm-hmm.
home citizenship, and
Yeah.
they aren't allowed to carry multiple passports. Canada has no problem if you have multiple nationalities, but you might come from a country that does. And I think I think that's a huge thing to give up. I think to give up the passport, your citizenship of the country you were born in, is
Yeah.
I don't know if I could do it. So I don't know that I could expect other people to do it either. As much as one might feel home in a new place and might integrate into a new society, I think part of the reason
Yeah.
people are maybe not transitioning to permanent residence is not wanting to give up their first passport. I mean, I understand I don't know the country you're from. It's more their rules and how they find out, and some people do it anyway, even though you're not supposed to. And that's their decision. I really don't care. But on the I think there's a risk that goes with it if you're trying to do it sneakily, and people just don't want to feel that discomfort. So I absolutely understand why people would not want to give up one passport. And I think maybe in past, when the world felt a little less connected, when it was easier to give up the passport that you took when you came on a plane to Canada, because you might only go back to your home country once or twice ever again in your life.
Yeah.
Relocating from another continent to come to Canada was a very different thing in 1977 than it is in 2023. We're a lot more connected now than we were even 10 or 20 years ago. People want to go back to the place they came from, use their passport to enter. And so I think we're a lot more globally mobile and connected than in the past. So people still stay in touch with where they come from, maybe more than they did 20 years ago when they moved to Canada, settled, and never looked back. So I think that's part of it. And then there's also been some conversations about if Canada is doing a good enough job of making people who move here integrate fully, as you said, feel that sense of that this is home. I talk to people who say Canada is really good at branding and marketing, but for being welcoming, but not so good at the actual implementation of integration and making sure that people from around the world do feel welcome here, that they do feel like they're a part of Canadian society. And I wonder if that is maybe part of why we're not seeing as many people transition to Canadian citizenship. Is do people like I said if I returned to my time in France, that I felt like I would never truly be French. Is it that people are feeling that they will never truly be Canadian, and so they don't want to go get the passport, that they're here for they have permanent residence, gives them enough security, enough peace of mind that they don't have to get a Canadian passport. I think the full citizenship, there's a few benefits. One is that you can vote.
Yeah.
You have to feel a sense of civic engagement. Some people maybe don't care, they want to vote. Some people feel very passionate about voting.
Yeah.
Depending on where you come from and the reasons you moved here, the ability to vote and the way Canada's democracy works, I think, can be one major attraction for coming here if you didn't have fair and free elections in your home country. For others, that may not be as important. The other is for travel. The Canadian passport provides a lot more visa-free travel around the world than other passports.
Yeah.
So that's another one of the attractions. I think part of it is permanent residence is a pretty good status too. It's as long as you maintain your residency requirements here about 2 out of every 5 years, you have all of the other rights and responsibilities of being a Canadian that you do as a citizen. I even have some friends in my life who I've had to push. I just apply for citizenship already, because mostly because I see them forgetting to renew their PR cards and then not being able to, take a trip somewhere that they had planned because of this administrative procedure of renewing a PR card. But they, even though they've rich and full lives here, they didn't feel they needed to transition to citizenship fully. Because I don't know, maybe I should ask them that. Maybe I should probe this with my friends a bit further.
Yeah, but it does make sense, Matthew, giving up citizenship being one of the reasons. And I think in my case, I come from India, and if I choose to be a Canadian, I cannot hold an Indian passport anymore. But I think all in all, these decisions are very subjective to everybody. Like you said, you don't know what country or situation they have come from, or what was their whys of coming to this new country.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Everybody has a different why for coming to Canada. They're very similar, but each why is an individual one.
So Matthew, now we are in the final segment of the podcast. I call it Beneath the Accent, because we are knowing each other beneath the accent. I'm going to ask a couple of questions. You can answer them in one word or a sentence, or however you feel like. The idea is just to know more about you. So ready?
Sure, let's go.
So first is, what advice would you give to younger Matthew?
Believe in yourself.
Any worst advice someone ever gave you?
I can't think of anything. I guess I've gotten pretty good advice over the years. Maybe I'm lucky. Nothing comes to mind.
What's the best piece of advice someone ever gave you?
The best piece of advice is to follow my gut, to trust my gut.
Is there anything you recently bought and you now regret?
Yes, a pair of cheap sunglasses that lasted just one day. I know that's not a profound answer, but I'm like, you know what? I've learned the lesson. Sometimes spend an extra couple dollars and get better quality.
Okay. So what's the most expensive thing you own?
The condo I'm sitting in now, although I actually only own 20% of it.
So what's the most expensive thing you would like to own?
Really secure suitcase with wheels that will not break easily that I can take around the world.
Well, that does not exist, Matthew.
Maybe that's the new challenge is to design it. That's my next career.
Okay. So speaking of that, tell us what's next on your bucket list.
So I'm at a really exciting transition in my life right now. So I talked about different chapters in my life of I was in Manitoba, I was in Ottawa, I was in France, I was in Macedonia. I've now been in Toronto for 10 years, and I've been working in the university and college system. And I've also been working in Canadian immigration. I've decided to quit working in the university and college sector. So I'm leaving that this year, and I'm going to be doing my immigration work full time. And I'm doing it with my husband. The two of us have decided to make this our full time occupation, and we are also going to follow our dreams of seeing more of the world. So we will be taking a year off from Toronto, and we are going to spend some time living with our families in Manitoba and Macedonia. And yesterday we just confirmed an apartment in Buenos Aires that we're going to be spending 6 months there. And we want to go out and see more of the world. And we're going to work on learning Spanish and meeting new people and going through those exact same culture shocks and transitions so that we can build greater empathy with our clients.
Wow, sounds exciting. And I think after that, we can have a second part to this episode.
I'd love to do that.
Okay. So who's your go-to person?
My husband. It's more so than my parents, my family. I go to the person who like me, is a nomad, who is a risk taker, and who has a heart.
If you could have dinner with any historical figure or any public figure, who would it be and why?
I'd like to have dinner with Jesus, actually. I grew up in an evangelical Christian circle, and even though I'm not a practicing Christian now, I'd really like to be like, who are you really? And are you who people say you are? And what's your vibe?
I must say that's one of the best answers I have got. I'll say that. So if you could eat one cuisine for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Mexican.
And are there any movies that you like to watch over and over again? Or just name some of your favorite movies?
Moulin Rouge. Baz Luhrmann is one of the craziest directors I have fallen in love with. So I will watch things by him, and also Tim Burton, which is, I like that kind of spooky aesthetic. I could watch all of their stuff no matter what it is.
If you could have one superpower, what would it be?
Flying. I would love to fly like Superman.
So describe Canada in one word or a sentence.
Experiment.
So finally, Matthew, if you could leave me with one piece of advice, what would it be?
Keep talking to people and learning more about the world and Canada in the way that you're doing. I think that openness and eagerness to speak to other people, to learn their stories, and to grow yourself through the process is a beautiful characteristic that you should keep at.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words. So on that note, Matthew, thank you so much for being on the podcast and adding value to my listeners. Thank you.
Thanks. My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, listener. Thank you for making it to the end. I highly, highly appreciate you listening to the podcast. Subscribe to the podcast if you haven't as yet. And please share with your friends or anybody you think would like it. And like I always say, we encourage you to follow your heart, but also us on Instagram. The handle is mythicaccent. You can also leave us a review or write to us at hello@mythicaccent.com. So stay tuned and let's continue knowing each other beneath the accent.